All right, it is 4:02, and I'm going to start talking about Drupal text formats and input filters at 4:02 on a Friday afternoon after a long day of sessions. So you are either here because you fell asleep in one of the previous sessions, you are lost, you are a really hardcore Drupal person, or you're genuinely curious about Drupal text formats and input filters. I'm not going to make you say which one of those it is. All right. So this talk says beginner on it. How many of you consider yourselves beginners? I see some people raising their hands that are not beginners. But... Okay, so I've got some code at the end. It's not real scary code, but there's just a little bit of it. We'll work our way up to that. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the theory, why we have input filters, text formats in Drupal, what they are. I'm going to show you what can go wrong if you think to yourself, like a lot of people who are skipping this presentation, it's no big deal. I'll just keep pushing buttons until it works. I'll tell you what goes wrong when you choose the wrong text format. We'll look at the user interface a little bit, where in Drupal you can configure text formats, and then we'll do just a little bit of looking at the code at the end. So we're going to start out with theory and philosophy. What is text? Drupal is built on the idea that you enter content into your web browser. Should be an easy thing to do. And when you set up a website and you've got users, you have certain expectations. You think they're just going to enter text into my web page. This is text. And then people start entering other stuff. For example, okay, this is what we expect. But suddenly we realize it's not just text. People can actually enter HTML tags in Drupal by default. And that's not a big deal either. But if you've been active on the internet for a while, you know that there's different forums, different social media sites where it's not really HTML, because HTML is too hard for people to learn. So they've kind of dumbed it down. This is called BB code. It's been around for a long time. You can put really small tags around your words, and they might get bolded or underlined, or they might blink or something. So that's not really plain text, and it's not really HTML. But it's still just ASCII text characters. So now we've got a number of different options. Well, most of us have users that don't really like working in environments that don't have this toolbar. And generally, in our environment, I give them about 6 or 7 different buttons on this toolbar that they use the most. But here we've got a situation where we've got actual bold text. What is that underneath? Is it strong? Is it a B tag? Different situations that Drupal needs to handle. So when it comes down to it, I'm just going to stop here, but there are lots of other situations that you'll run into where people will enter things that you weren't expecting. Maybe because they haven't had training, or they're pasting something from Microsoft Word. So text is complicated. It's not as simple as just assuming that everybody's putting in plain text. So we've talked about plain text, HTML, BB code, and WYSIWYG editors so far. So Drupal has a philosophy of whatever the person types in, that's what we're going to store. When you enter something into a web page in Drupal, hit submit, and it's accepted. Whatever you typed in, even if it was full of crazy tags, that goes into the database. Then, when Drupal comes to display that page, when we're taking information from the database and giving it out to the browser, that's when we run these filters. So a bunch of stuff comes from the database and goes through this filter, and out comes beautiful, clean output. And because we're talking about web pages, Drupal builds HTML output so your browser can read it. So here's an example. This is one of the filters that is in Drupal 7, core Drupal. You don't have to worry about putting in p tags. You can just hit return twice and you have nice paragraphs come out. Well, that's because in the background there's a filter running that is looking for those double returns and replacing them with nicely wrapped paragraph tags. Here's something else we run into. Generally, people are allowed to enter some HTML on a Drupal site, but they aren't always real good about closing their tags. That could cause problems with the rest of your web page. If you have an open tag, all of a sudden things go wonky. So Drupal ships with a core filter that makes sure that all of the tags in the body area are closed. So in this case, it's added this closing tag. You'll notice that there are more than one filter. There's more than one filter here. So this is the case where we've gone through one filter, and then we've gone through another filter. The output from the previous filter becomes the input from the next filter, and we can just stack them up. So here's a set of 4 core filters that are in Drupal 7. First, there's a filter that scans the input for, you may have pasted in a URL from some website. And it's sort of a pain if you're looking at a web page and you see a URL and that URL is not clickable. I mean, you've got to copy it, you've got to paste it into your browser. What a pain. So Drupal by default just goes through and turns those into clickable links. And the other thing this filter does is if it's a URL that's like this long, it only displays the first 72 characters, and that's configurable. You can display just the first 10 characters or 200 characters, whatever you want. After that's been done, then Drupal runs it through a filter that looks at all of the HTML tags that were used in the text and only allows through the ones that you've said it's okay. And by default, that's a pretty restrictive set. What happens to the other ones? Generally, they are either escaped, which means you can actually see them in the output, or they disappear, they're stripped out. Generally, that's the option that you want, because you don't want people to see what people have been entering. If it's something bad, we just suppress it. And then there are 2 friends, the paragraph tag filter and the tag closing filter. That's Rex.
Why doesn't that happen going in instead of coming out? Because every time it comes out, you've got to do that over and over and over again.
So the question is, why are we doing that over and over again? Why don't we filter text as it's coming in? And there's several answers to that. One is, it's just been a long-time philosophy for Drupal to just save raw input. You may want to go back and rearrange these filters. If you didn't have the original input that somebody had put in, you wouldn't be able to do that. There might have been stuff stripped out that now you want. And the other question is, isn't that a performance problem? I mean, you've got to run this text through on every web page hit. Well, Drupal is really smart about that. Once something goes through a filter system, it goes into a database table called cache filter. And that filtered text, that's what Drupal uses. So it only does it once. So this is a group of filters. And the filters are arranged in a certain order. We would call them a group of filters, right? But Drupal has this odd habit of inventing weird terminology that's really kind of meaningless, and we would never actually call this a group of filters. We're going to call this a text format. Okay? If you're using Drupal 6, the terminology was even more obscure. We called it an input format. But really, all it is a group of filters in a certain order. Well, not even in a certain order. It's just a group of filters. And actually, Drupal will tell you this. all you have to do is read the comments in the code inside the filter.api.php file that's sitting in your module/filter directory. There it is. A group of filters is referred to as a text format. Of course, you all read through that, right? So this is a text format. It's the same text format regardless of which order the filters are run through. It's just the fact that they're this certain collection of filters that makes up a text format. Now, obviously, the order is important here. If you look at the one on the right, suppose that you are going to strip out the HTML first. Then if a filter later tries to do something with it, it's already been stripped out. So you have to think carefully about which order these go in. And this often becomes a problem if you're using a WYSIWYG editor that adds tags. And you may be kind of beating your head against Drupal for a while, wondering, why are these tags just disappearing? I'm clicking this button and it should be working fine, but what I'm getting is just sort of a really reduced text output. Well, you probably have to rearrange your filter formats. And that's usually buried in some of the readmes that go along with the WYSIWYG editor installs. So Drupal ships with a couple of text formats by default. And you can make your own text formats, as many as you want. And you can also assign roles to access them. So you don't want to just give full HTML to everybody. You want to give it only to a group of administrators that have an administrative role. That's great, you can do that. So this solves the problem of, well, we want to filter our HTML everywhere, but I have this group of people who really should be able to enter more tags than this other group of people. Well, that's simple. You can just create another text format that has the same filters in it. And then you can go in to configure the subset of HTML that's allowed on the second text format. Obviously name it something different, like administrative filtered HTML. And now you can have two groups that have different restrictive HTML subsets. So user interface, I was just going to go through that for a minute in case you haven't. So you'll find the text format configuration section under configuration. And text formats. Try to get this a little bigger here. Okay, so we have some text formats that are here by default. And if you don't understand that text formats are a collection of filters, you may be confused by this screen. What you really need to do is drill down one more level, and that's what the configure operation does. So remember the filtered HTML? Here we've got the enabled filters. And down here we've got the filter processing order. And you can just drag these around to change. I have the nice colorful blocks. Drupal just gives you a list here that you can drag and change the processing order. And then below that, it gives you some filter settings. So we were talking about converting URLs into links. And here's a setting that goes along with that filter. Filters may have global settings or settings specific to a text format. And they'll change that depending on where it makes the most sense. So down here is where you want to go, limit allowed HTML tags. And this is where you want to edit in a few other things. For your editors, you might want to put an image tag in there. Otherwise, they won't be able to insert images into the body. You may want to remove some of these things. Definition lists are in here, but people generally don't use that very much. And then you'd hit Save Configuration, and it would update. And just a peek behind the scenes, what's really happening over here is over here in the database, there's a filter table. and a filter format table. And that's where it keeps track of all the installed filters. So if you really want to get under the hood, that's where you would find where Drupal's really storing that data. Now, the other place that you'll see this, of course, is in the Add Content screen. Down at the bottom, and this is probably fairly familiar to you, where you can change between different filter formats. Okay, so now the biggest question that I get from beginning Drupalers is, what's wrong with just using the full HTML format? It doesn't frustrate me. I can just put in whatever I want and it just works. I mean, isn't Drupal about creating HTML pages? Why should I be limited? And the first thing to realize is full HTML actually gives you less than filtered HTML. It's only 3 filters, and the filtered HTML is 4. So before you use the full HTML filter, you may want to think, why not just paste a list of all the HTML tags into the allowed HTML in the filtered HTML text format? That'll give you the same thing, and then later, if you change your mind, you can always step back. If you choose full HTML from the outset, you're going to have trouble making that step back. Okay, here's the trouble. Script is an HTML tag. And if you're not going to have Drupal strip that out, it's available for people to use, even if you didn't think about it. Even if you thought they're just going to use image and P and A and things like that, there are other tags out there, things like iframe. Well, here's an example of using a script tag with just a little bit of code. And so we can go to local.dev. I've entered this into a node here. Site name would be helpful. Here we go. DrupalCorn detected, returning to mothership. And it redirected us to Drupal.org. You might imagine that you may not get redirected to a nice site like Drupal.org. The other thing people can do with full HTML is put image tags in, including image tags that don't reside on your server. If you want to get really nefarious, you could kind of find out the CSS that's being used on this site, build yourself another site someplace else that uses the same kind of look and feel, and then maybe instead of redirecting to Drupal.org, you would redirect to a login page somewhere else. And the person would think, oh, somehow I got logged out. I'll just have to log in again. And then you have a security breach. So that's just really the tip of the iceberg. If you Google full HTML security, you'll find lots of other terrible things that people can do. And that's why you never want to use the full HTML filter. The other thing is people who are a little bit more tech savvy, and they come from an environment where they're used to creating PHP pages on a file system. Well, PHP is great. You can do almost anything with PHP. I can do things like this. You know, I can show content to one type of user who's logged in and one type of user who's not logged in. The problem with PHP is that it's really powerful. So even if this is what you want to do, you could do lots of other stuff. Remember, Drupal is written in PHP. So Drupal tries very hard to keep the code that's running separate from content. So if you are going to enable this PHP filter, you are breaching that wall. And you're saying, my content and my code are now interspersed. So I'll just give a little demo here as to what you could do. Let's see. So I'm going to use a different browser. I'm not logged in as administrator anymore. I'm just logged in as somebody who's going to create a basic page. And you'll notice the text format is PHP code. And supposing that I just paste in this PHP code here, I hit the preview button. Of course, my title is required. Oh, look. I've just dumped out all of the email addresses from the user database. And you know what? I just previewed this page. I didn't actually create a node. I just ran preview. So I can walk away at this point, and you as the site administrator, unless you're really watching your watchdog entries, are going to have no idea that this has happened. And it doesn't stop there, right? Drupal stores lots of stuff in the database. And if you've got access to that database, you can get things like Drupal's private key. Fortunately, Drupal's very good about storing passwords in a very encrypted fashion. So you could retrieve hash passwords, but it's not really going to help you because they're going to have these huge, long, useless hashes. But there's lots of other interesting information that you could get out. And that's why in Drupal 7, anytime you encounter the PHP filter, you'll probably also encounter a great big warning that says, only give this to administrative users. And this is why. Because anybody you give this to has complete access to not only your site, but the database behind it. Okay, so this is when to use the full HTML text format. And I apologize, this is a little snarky, but if you're too lazy to copy paste a whitelist of HTML tags into the filtered HTML configuration page, then you could use full HTML. I see lots of people using full HTML because they don't want to be bothered to learn about text formats. It's confusing, it's just really confusing, I just want it to work. Or, and this is what we always come to, if you give people a nice toolbar and a WYSIWYG editor, you will get Comic Sans on your site. And that's because you will be allowing the style tag. And that's just inevitable. Here's the whitelist. It's really not that long. These are tags that people can use. I've put some of them in yellow. They're a little bit more dangerous. You want to give them to people you trust. The image tag, obviously, because you could put in images from anywhere. The table tag, because if you don't have the HTML corrector filter running and you have a table-based layout and people start closing rows and closing cells, that could really mess things up. But it's not that hard to get a whitelist. So when to use the PHP code text format is if you want to provide access to your database to someone who's entering your content. It's probably easier to just give them access to PHPMyAdmin, because the interface is a lot nicer. Or if you like mixing your code logic and your content together, that's sort of Drupal's philosophy is to get away from that, right? You want your content over here and your business logic over here. Or another good reason would be you need to test your backups. Because after your site has been hacked, you'll need your backups to go back and put it back up. Okay. Just while I was researching for this talk, I went to Drupal.org and looked at what's available out there. I mean, there's the core input filters, but what else is out there? So what the filters are doing, they're running the body text or the text of a field through some sort of process. We can let your imagination run wild, and what could we do by scanning text? So this is an interesting one, the internal links module. So it's going to look for links to other pages on your site, and then it's going to find the node that's at that link, get the title from the node, and put it into the title attribute of your link. That way you can link a word to another node on your site, and when you mouse over, the hover text is going to show the title of the node. I thought that was kind of cool. And this module also comes with the hide bad filter. So if you unpublish a node, in that case, the link will not work. The link will be removed. I thought that was kind of neat too. It keeps you from having dead content. Then there's a glossary module that's been around for quite a while. You can set certain terms, and when those terms appear in your body text, they have little icons next to them. You can hover over them and learn what they mean. There's a syntax highlighter module. It will colorize code listings, and it uses an external library, just like CKEditor uses the external CKEditor library. There are other libraries for code syntax coloring. And there's the smileys filter. It's going to go through and replace your little text smileys with actual graphical smileys. There's the pirate module. I'll just read the quote there. One day a year, it changes all the English phrases into pirate speak by adding R. And this was the most interesting one I found, the chessboard renderer. There's a syntax out there to describe game boards. And this will allow you to describe it in text, and it will come out as an actual nicely rendered chessboard. Okay, so I'm going to pause at this moment before we go a little bit deeper into the filter system and just ask for general questions. Yes.
What about restricting certain attributes on tags? So if you have a bottom paragraph tag, but you don't want people putting their own style attribute in there, and the example I gave is, I ran into this for myself as a user. I was using a site that had my profile on it, and being a designer, I didn't like the way they were spacing something, so I thought, oh, I'll just throw a style tag on this tag here and add a little bit of better padding or something like that. And it ended up, I broke it, my name or whatever it was completely disappeared, and I had to call. So is it possible to restrict different attributes?
So the question is whether it's possible to restrict different attributes inside tags. And I'm a little fuzzy on that, but I seem to remember that check markup, which is doing some heavy lifting inside, actually has code that goes through and looks at attributes as well and strips out evil attributes. I'm pretty sure the style tag doesn't get in there. Michael?
So check out the WYSIWYG filter. And so it does a good job of, you can check which, it's a big master checklist of not only the tags, but the styles within inside of those tags too. And so the WYSIWYG filter can be a way of getting it.
Okay, WYSIWYG filter. Other questions? Okay, let's look a little bit into writing a filter, and this is probably going to be a little technical for those of you who are just using the UI. It's kind of a glimpse behind the scenes. So I don't know if you've gone to a site called YouTube, but YouTube comments are generally, they're not worth reading. And so this person here has created a little plugin for your web browser. And if you download this and install it, the comments will actually come out, instead of comments, it'll just be herp, derp, derp, herp, herp, which is really about the same. So I thought, why not write a Drupal module that does that? Because often the content we get is sort of the same. So Drupal has a hook for filters. Hook filter info is the hook that you want to implement in your module if you're going to write a filter. And this hook describes to Drupal a lot of things about, basically everything about your filter. What its name is, description, whether it's cacheable or not, what process it's going to run. So you might wonder where these things are coming from in the UI. So here's an example of hook filter info. And we've got the title and the description. So these are the things that show up on the administrative screen. And a good place to look, there's two good places to look if you have an idea for a good filter or you want to make your own filter. One is just the filter module inside Drupal. It's got those core filters in it, and you can go in, and the code is actually very readable and very short. The other one is the example module. If you go on Drupal.org, there's an example module, which is actually a package of examples for just about any kind of module you'd want to write. And there's a filter example module there too, and that's actually where I started with. I didn't start from scratch. I just used the example and then changed some things. So in hook filter info, there's a settings callback setting. And that settings callback, the value of that is the name of the function that should be called. That's going to return the settings for the filter. So where you're going to see that is right here. Those are the filter settings specific to one individual filter. So if you're writing a filter, you're going to write some sort of function that is going to use the form API to put some form elements together. And here we've got, a basic text field and a description. You could use a checkbox instead, or have radio buttons, or whatever your filter needs. Then there's the tips callback. So you'll write a function that outputs HTML, and this is what you see at the bottom of the page. That's where this is coming from. And in fact, there's two versions of this. One is the short version here, and if you've ever clicked on the more information about text formats, I mean, you get 2 pages of nice description about how the filtered HTML works, and there's a nice table there. So that's where that's coming from. Now the core of a filter module is the code that it's going to take text in, and it's going to do something to it, and then it's going to return the changed text. So in hook filter info, that's the process callback. I'm just going to take a little step aside here and say there's also a callback that lets you prepare before any filters run. So the way Drupal works is, okay, we're ready to run the filters. Before we do anything with the text and start modifying it, we're going to give each filter a chance to do something with the text first. So generally what you do is if you have something that some other filter may mess with, maybe you've got some HTML that you want to preserve, here's your chance to go in there and change it into a token, which you can then later in the process callback change that token into something else. And there's best practices for this on Drupal.org. And if you go to the api.drupal.org page that talks about filters, there's a nice link to a book page on Drupal.org that describes how you should do this process. That's too deep to go into here. So when writing this filter, there's got to be a process function that takes text in and modifies it and then returns a chunk of text. And that text then will be given to the next filter in the lineup. And it will keep running until we're all the way through, and then that will be returned. So here's a full hook filter info for the herp-derp filter. And you'll notice that there's actually a sub-array here. It's inside filter info, we've got filters herp-derp. That's because one module can have more than one filter. So you could fill out this array, and then before the return filters at the bottom, you could have a second array that has a completely different filter inside your module. But we've only got one here. And this has got all the information that Drupal needs. I will say that filters are either cacheable or non-cacheable. If you have a really dynamic filter, maybe it throws in, stock quotes that are real time or something like that, you can declare that your filter should not be cached. Okay, now think back to text formats. Text formats are a collection of filters. So the filter that you just created is dynamic, but it's also sort of toxic, because if you were to add it to a text format like the filtered HTML format, throw your filter in there at the bottom. Now Drupal recognizes one of these is not cacheable, therefore the whole bunch is not cacheable. And then you've just lost all the performance from the filter caching that we talked about earlier. So generally, this isn't a problem, but it's something to be aware of. Okay, here we go. So we are going to create a basic page here. I'm going to go to modules. I've got the chessboard renderer turned off. Here's our herp-derp filter, 7.x alpha 1, which means it's barely running. turn that on, add some content, and I'm going to go down here, and I've added it actually to the filtered HTML. Could maybe look at that first. Down here under text formats, configure. You notice that the herp-derp filter is active, and so let's add that content. I'm going to remember the title this time. Okay, and we'll just preview this. Everything goes well. We have everything translated into herp-derp. And that concludes my presentation. Any questions? Thanks.
When you're talking about images, is there any module available for checking images to be sure that they are moderately safe?
I think I came across a filter that checked to make sure that images were internal, but I couldn't guarantee that. Imagine if there's not one, it would be very easy to write. In the back.
So it's going to be just a matter of time. We looked at whitelist. One of the ones that's not on there was iframes. It's going to be just a matter of time before we get a support request. I put in my YouTube video, it tried to duplicate me, and it's not showing up. So is that something that can be addressed with text formats, or is that more something that should be addressed with a separate module?
So the question is whether, if you need to post something that has an iframe, like a YouTube video, should that be a separate module, or should that be part of the filter system, or what? I would say, who's posting this? Are you allowing people to just post, YouTube videos to your site? Probably not. If it's you, the administrator, that is doing that, then you should be using an administrative text format that has more tags in it than the general user base would use, and some other Drupal role would use. Does that answer the question?
If the idea of decentralized content creation, with the administrative functions to be separate from the person who's actually posting that content, you're going to have lesser permissions. And so how do you allow for that? And there's been various attempts to do YouTube, and some work better than others, but what it boils down to is what you don't want to do is just allow them to use that iframe today uncontrolled, because then you open the whole can of worms.
That's right. Yeah, you never want to let that happen out of your control. But I would say one of the things that we didn't cover here, but really you should think about a lot when you're designing a site, is what is the structure of the permission system? Which roles, who has which roles overlap? Drupal has a really fine-grained permission system, so it's easy to give people exactly what they need. It's difficult to enumerate in advance exactly what people need, and sometimes even which roles there will be. So I would say that's one of the information architecture things about Drupal that should be part of every site planning phase. Yes?
Is it possible to control which filters on and when dynamically at runtime? And can you format your response in herp-derp, please?
Herp-derp, derp-derp-de-doo, ding. Yeah. Runtime, there's always a trade-off between runtime and performance, right? Like the filter system who likes to do things and then put it away, and that's where your performance comes from. You can always do things at runtime. Filters have built-in hooks for when a filter is enabled or disabled, when configuration has happened, so that it can respond and do things at those times. But those are administration, configuration types of things, not page serving kinds of things. You could, however, envision a filter that itself runs first and controls which other filters run. So you can always, Drupal usually has places that you can hook in. Any other questions? All right, people are mostly still awake. Thank you.